The first laugh came before the church bell ever rang. Pastor Daniel Brooks heard it through the open front door as he carried a dented metal bucket filled with fresh-cut wildflowers toward the pulpit. It wasn't loud enough to be cruel on purpose, just loud enough to remind him how small his world had become. "Can you believe he's still trying?" one man said. "I heard they're down to single digits now," another answered. "Wouldn't surprise me if they sell the place before Christmas." A third voice chuckled. "I'd buy the land. Better use for it than a church nobody goes to." Daniel paused only long enough to set the flowers on the communion table. He closed his eyes for one quiet breath, then reached into his jacket pocket and unfolded the same piece of paper he had carried every Sunday for nearly 15 years. On it were 12 names. Some had moved away. Some had passed into eternity. Some hadn't stepped inside Little Cedar Chapel in years. But every Sunday morning, before anyone arrived, he whispered every name to God as though they might still walk through those old wooden doors. Outside, tires crunched over the gravel parking lot. He smiled without looking. Maybe today, maybe one of them. When he finally stepped into the sanctuary, the familiar scent wrapped around it like an old quilt-aged pine, lemon furniture polish, hymn books worn soft from generations of hands, and just the faintest trace of rain that had found its way through the patched roof sometime during the night. The building had stood since 1912. Every board seemed to remember a story. The stained glass windows glowed with gentle colors as the Kansas morning sun climbed over endless wheat fields surrounding the little town of Willow Creek. Dust floated through beams of light like tiny stars suspended in worship. Daniel walked slowly down every aisle. As always, he straightened each hymnal. He pushed every chair perfectly into place. He wiped fingerprints from the backs of empty pews no one had occupied in months, not because anyone would notice, because someone might. By 8:45, Martha Lewis arrived. She drove the same faded blue sedan she'd owned for almost 20 years, parking in the exact same spot beside the old oak tree. At 72, arthritis had bent her fingers until playing piano had become difficult. But somehow every Sunday those same hands still managed to fill the sanctuary with hymns that sounded less like performance and more like prayer. She stepped inside carrying 2 pies. "You skipped breakfast again." Daniel smiled. "What makes you think that?" "You forgot to hide the coffee stains on your shirt." He looked down and laughed. "I really ought to become more convincing. You ought to learn that pastors need feeding too." She set 1 pie in the fellowship hall before noticing another small bucket sitting beneath the leak near the back wall. It dripped again. "Only during the storm. Did you call anyone?" "I patched it, Daniel. It'll hold." She looked toward the ceiling. "It always holds until the next rain." He answered with the same gentle smile that had carried half the town through funerals. "Droughts, bankruptcies, and broken marriages. We've survived worse." Had they? Sometimes he wasn't sure anymore. Years ago, Little Cedar Chapel had filled every pew. Children had laughed in the hallways. Teenagers crowded the youth room downstairs. Potluck dinners spilled onto the front lawn. Now, the elementary school had closed. The grain elevator employed half as many workers. Families left for Wichita, Kansas City, anywhere opportunities still existed. Churches emptied because towns emptied. No scandal. No dramatic collapse, just silence, one family at a time. By 9 o'clock, 7 people had arrived. Mr. Henderson, the Wilson sisters, old Frank Dawson with his hearing aid whistling softly, a widow named Claire, Martha, Daniel. Then Jacob Turner wandered in. No one expected him, especially not Daniel. Jacob was 17, tall, thin, always looked tired. His dark hoodie stayed pulled halfway over his head regardless of weather, as if hiding from a world he'd already decided didn't want him. Rumors traveled quickly through Willow Creek. His father had left years earlier. His mother worked double shifts at the diner outside town. Jacob skipped school almost as often as he attended. Some blamed bad choices. Others blamed bad luck. Daniel blamed loneliness. Jacob didn't sit with anyone. He claimed the last pew near the back door. He never sang. Never prayed aloud, never stayed after service, but he kept coming. Not every week, just enough that Daniel noticed, after the final hymn, while everyone gathered downstairs for coffee, Daniel found Jacob standing alone outside beneath the old church bell. "Glad you came." Jacob shrugged. "It was quiet here." Daniel nodded. "Sometimes quiet helps." Jacob stared across the wheat fields without speaking. After a long silence, he asked, "You ever think about quitting?" Daniel smiled. "More than you'd think." Jacob looked surprised. "I thought pastors weren't supposed to admit that." "I think honesty is one reason God keeps us humble." "So, why don't you?" Daniel glanced back at the little white chapel. Its paint peeled around the windows. The front steps leaned slightly to one side. A section of roof carried mismatched shingles from repairs done by volunteers who had long since moved away. "Because every Sunday I remember something." "What?" "I've never been asked to fill the building." Jacob frowned. "I don't get it. I've only been asked to keep opening the doors." Jacob didn't answer. He simply nodded once before walking toward the highway, hands buried deep inside his pockets. Daniel watched until the young man disappeared around the corner. Something about that conversation stayed with him all afternoon. The following Wednesday, Daniel worked his second job unloading livestock feed at Carter Farm Supply. He had started there 6 years earlier, when church offerings no longer covered utilities. Most customers recognized him. Some apologized. Others admired his willingness to work. Daniel never felt embarrassed. Paul made tense. He often reminded himself there was dignity in honest labor. Late that afternoon, Emily Carter walked into the store carrying a camera bag over one shoulder. She had returned to Willow Creek after nearly a decade in Topeka, where she had worked as a newspaper reporter before budget cuts eliminated half the staff. Now she wrote for the county paper, covering everything from school board meetings to harvest festivals. "Pastor Brooks, Emily, you still remember me? I baptized your little brother." She laughed. "I suppose that's hard to forget." She looked around the mostly empty store before lowering her voice. "I'm working on a series about old landmarks around the county." Daniel nodded. "You should. I was wondering if I could photograph the church sometime." "Of course." She hesitated. "The editor wants to call it the smallest congregation in the county." Daniel smiled so gently that Emily suddenly wished she hadn't mentioned the title. "That would probably be accurate. You don't mind." "I've learned accuracy isn't always the enemy." She studied him for a moment. Most people became defensive when discussing decline. Daniel simply accepted reality without surrendering hope. It intrigued her. "I'll stop by Sunday. We'll leave the doors open." "They usually are." "They always are." As Emily walked away, she turned back. "Can I ask you something?" "Certainly. Do you honestly believe the church has a future?" Daniel considered the question longer than expected. Finally, he answered, "I believe people always have a future." She waited. "And churches? They exist for people." It wasn't really an answer, yet somehow it felt like one. Sunday arrived beneath gray skies. Wind rode endlessly across the prairie. Only 8 people sat inside the sanctuary. Emily quietly photographed stained glass windows, weathered pews, faded hymn books, Martha playing piano with swollen hands. She also photographed Daniel, not while preaching, while he prepared, before anyone else arrived. She watched him straighten every empty pew, adjust every hymnal, dust every windowsill. Polish brass candle holders no one noticed anymore. He moved with the care of a man expecting honored guests. Emily lowered her camera. "Why do you clean seats nobody uses?" Daniel looked genuinely puzzled. "They're not nobody's seats, but they're empty. For now." His answer lingered in her mind long after service ended. That evening she drove home by the back road overlooking the church. As she slowed near the hill, something caught her attention. An old pickup truck sat nearly a quarter-mile away beside an abandoned fence line. Its engine was off. Someone sat inside, watching the church. Emily assumed they were simply resting until, the following Sunday, she noticed the same truck, same place, same time. Again, no one got out. Week after week, it remained. Always before service. Always leaving shortly after everyone else. When Emily casually mentioned it to Martha during coffee one morning, the older woman smiled softly. "I've seen it too." "You know who it is?" "No." "You've never gone to ask?" Martha shook her head. "If someone wants to stay hidden, sometimes kindness means letting them. But don't you wonder?" Every Sunday, one rainy afternoon, Daniel climbed onto the church roof carrying shingles donated by a retired contractor. Rain had damaged another section overnight. As he balanced near the edge, a gust of Kansas wind caught him off guard. His foot slipped. For one terrifying instant, he felt nothing beneath him. Then a strong hand grabbed his jacket. Frank Dawson, 81 years old, somehow still strong enough to pull him back. They sat together on the roof afterward, both breathing harder than either wished to admit. Frank looked over the empty town. "You know." "What?" "I've attended this church 73 years. Daniel smiled. "I know. I've buried my parents from here. So have many. I married Ruth here." "I remember." Frank's eyes drifted toward the cemetery behind the chapel. "I'll probably leave from here too." Daniel didn't answer. Frank continued. "I don't care if there are 8 people or 800. He looked directly at Daniel. "Just promise me one thing." "What is it?" "If I'm still breathing, don't ever lock those front doors." Daniel swallowed hard. "I promise." That night, unable to sleep, he walked through the silent sanctuary alone. Moonlight spilled across empty pews. He sat where Jacob usually sat, then where Martha always sat, then in the front row where children once crowded during Christmas pageants. He imagined voices that no longer echoed there, laughter, babies crying, choirs singing. The memories hurt, but somehow they also healed. As he stood to leave, he noticed something through the front window. Far beyond the churchyard, near the old fence line, headlights, the same pickup truck. The engine idled for only a moment before slowly disappearing into the darkness. This time, however, Daniel noticed something he had never seen before. Just before the truck drove away, the driver stepped out, only for a few seconds, long enough to place something on the ground beside the weathered mailbox at the edge of the church property. Then the stranger climbed back inside and vanished into the Kansas night. When Daniel hurried outside, the road was empty. The only thing waiting beside the mailbox was a small, weathered wooden box with no name, no note, and a rusted brass latch that looked as though it hadn't been opened in decades. He reached down, lifted it carefully into his hands, and realized it was much heavier than it looked. Daniel carried the weathered wooden box into the fellowship hall instead of opening it outside. The old building was quiet except for the soft ticking of the wall clock Martha had donated years ago in memory of her late husband. Rain tapped gently against the windows, and for a long moment he simply rested both hands on the lid, studying the scratches worn into the wood. Whoever had left it behind hadn't chosen an ordinary container. It had been cared for once, then forgotten, then somehow protected long enough to survive another generation. The rusted latch gave way with surprising ease. Inside lay a neatly folded piece of linen wrapped around several yellowed envelopes, a leather-bound notebook, and a black-and-white photograph whose edges had curled with age. Daniel lifted the photograph first. It showed the front steps of Little Cedar Chapel sometime in the late 1970s. Nearly 50 people stood smiling in front of the sanctuary. Children lined the first row. Farmers still wearing work boots stood beside young mothers holding babies. Near the center was a younger version of Pastor Harold Simmons, the man Daniel had replaced almost 3 decades earlier. Daniel recognized him immediately. What he didn't recognize was the little boy standing beside Pastor Harold. The child couldn't have been more than 8 years old. One hand clung tightly to the pastor's coat. The other held a small wooden cross. Someone had circled the boy's face in faded blue ink. Daniel frowned. He searched his memory, but found nothing. The notebook came next. Its first several pages contained ordinary church records: baptisms, weddings, funerals, prayer requests. Then the handwriting changed. It became deeply personal. Pastor Harold had written about people no one else seemed to remember anymore: widows, runaway teenagers, traveling families, children from broken homes. Entire pages described quiet acts of kindness that had never appeared in church newsletters. No applause, no recognition, only names and prayers. Daniel closed the notebook slowly. There was something sacred about reading another shepherd's private burdens. The envelopes remained unopened. Each carried only a first name written carefully across the front: Anna, Michael, Samuel, Grace. No last names, no return address, no explanation. Daniel slipped everything back into the box. Some stories, he thought, revealed themselves only when the time was right. Monday morning brought another reminder that faithfulness did not exempt anyone from practical problems. The electric company had mailed a final notice. The roof repairs had emptied the church savings account. The furnace, already older than most of the congregation, had begun making a grinding noise that worried everyone except Daniel, who simply prayed it would survive one more winter. Martha found him sitting at the office desk staring at the utility bill. "You've been looking at that paper for 10 minutes. I was hoping the number might get smaller." She smiled. "It hasn't? Not yet." She reached into her purse and quietly slid an envelope toward him. Daniel didn't touch it. "Martha, it's from Harold's memorial quilt auction. You already gave that to the church. I found another little savings account." "No, Daniel, no. You," she folded her arms. "You're as stubborn as every Brooks man before you. I won't take retirement money from you." She looked directly into his eyes. "It's not retirement money." "What is it?" "It's gratitude." He gently pushed the envelope back. "You've already given enough." She sighed. "You still don't understand why people stay here, do you?" Daniel looked confused. "I thought I did." "No." She smiled softly. "We don't stay because the building needs us." She glanced around the old sanctuary. "We stay because somewhere inside these walls, God found us." Her words lingered long after she had gone home. The next Sunday, Emily arrived earlier than usual. Instead of bringing only her camera, she carried a notebook. "I hope you don't mind." "Mind what?" "I'd like to spend the whole morning. You'll probably get bored." "I don't think I will." She followed Daniel through every part of his routine. She watched him unlock every entrance, replace burned-out light bulbs, refill communion cups, sweep leaves from the front porch, pray silently in each section of the sanctuary. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't impressive. It was simply consistent. While photographing old stained-glass windows, Emily noticed several names carved beneath one pew, children's initials, dates from decades ago. She smiled. "This place has fingerprints everywhere." Daniel nodded. "So do most faithful lives." Service that morning drew only 9 people. Halfway through the sermon, thunder rolled outside, shaking the old windows. Rain poured so hard that Daniel briefly wondered whether the roof patch had failed again. No one moved. No one complained. Martha continued playing the closing hymn as though storms belonged in church as much as sunshine. Afterward, while everyone lingered over coffee, Jacob quietly approached Daniel. "I need to ask you something." "Of course." Jacob hesitated. "If somebody keeps making the same mistakes." Daniel waited. "Does God eventually get tired?" The room suddenly felt very still. Daniel leaned against the old kitchen counter. "When I was your age, I asked almost the same question." "You did?" "Many times." "What happened?" "I finally realized I was measuring God's patience by my own." Jacob stared at the floor. "I got caught stealing again." Daniel wasn't surprised. "I'm supposed to go before the juvenile judge next week." He nodded. "My mom cried." "I'm sorry." "I've never seen her cry before." Silence settled between them. Finally, Jacob whispered something almost too quietly to hear. "I don't want to become the person everyone already thinks I am." Daniel rested a hand gently on the young man's shoulder. "Then don't." Jacob laughed bitterly. "It can't be that easy." "No." Daniel smiled. "But it can begin that simply." The following Thursday, Daniel attended Jacob's hearing. Only 3 people sat in the courtroom gallery. Jacob, his exhausted mother, Daniel. When the hearing ended, the judge surprised everyone. Instead of detention, Jacob received community service. Most teenagers would have been relieved. Jacob looked embarrassed. His assignment? Helping restore neglected public buildings around Willow Creek, including Little Cedar Chapel. The very next Saturday he appeared carrying paint clothes that looked older than he was. "I guess I'm working for you." Daniel laughed. "Looks more like we're working together." They spent hours scraping peeling paint from window frames. At first conversation came slowly. Eventually Jacob asked questions. "Why'd you become a pastor?" Daniel smiled. "I was going to become a veterinarian." Jacob blinked. "Seriously?" "I fainted during surgery observation." Jacob burst into laughter. "I don't believe that." "It's absolutely true." "So what changed?" "I discovered God kept putting people in front of me." Jacob nodded toward the church. "And now?" "Still does." By late afternoon both were covered in white paint. Neither seemed to notice. Across the street, Emily quietly photographed them from the sidewalk. Not because the scene was extraordinary, because somehow it was. A troubled teenager laughing beside an aging pastor while repairing a nearly forgotten church. The picture said more than any headline could. Several days later, Emily's article appeared in the county newspaper. The title wasn't what her editor originally wanted. Instead, it read, "The Little Church That Refuses to Close." The article never mentioned attendance numbers. It told stories about Martha's piano, about Frank's promise, about Daniel cleaning empty pews, about Jacob repainting old windows. Readers noticed. Phone calls began arriving. Some came from former residents now living hundreds of miles away. Others simply thanked the paper for publishing something hopeful. Daniel appreciated every kind word, but attendance didn't change. The next Sunday there were still only 10 people. He wasn't disappointed. He had learned long ago that encouragement and results rarely arrived on the same schedule. Yet something else was changing. Emily continued returning, not as a reporter, as a visitor. She rarely missed a Sunday now. Sometimes she brought muffins, sometimes flowers, sometimes nothing except questions. One afternoon she asked if he could see the old church records stored in the basement. Daniel unlocked the archive room. Dust covered nearly every shelf. Boxes filled with handwritten membership books, missionary letters, faded vacation Bible school photographs, and century-old newsletters lined the walls. Emily carefully sorted through decades of forgotten history. Hours passed. Then suddenly she called upstairs. "Daniel!" He hurried down. "What is it?" She held up an oversized scrapbook. Inside were newspaper clippings from the 1950s. The headlines astonished them. "Local farm boy leaves for Africa." "Mission hospital opens in Kenya." "Willow Creek missionary honored." "Teacher opens orphanage." Again and again the stories traced back to one place. Little Cedar Chapel. Dozens of missionaries, pastors, teachers, doctors, relief workers, all had once worshipped inside the tiny country church. Emily turned another page, then another. The names kept coming. "I had no idea." "Neither did I." She looked around the dusty basement in disbelief. "Daniel, this little church helped shape people who changed lives all over the world." He slowly nodded. "And almost no one remembers." Emily closed the scrapbook with unusual care. "I think they should." That evening she couldn't stop thinking about what she had found. The story had become much larger than an aging building. It was about invisible faithfulness echoing across generations. She decided to write another article. This one would not be about decline. It would be about legacy. Meanwhile, across town, another conversation unfolded. At Grace Emmett Church, the rapidly growing congregation just outside Willow Creek, Pastor Ethan Mercer sat reviewing regional attendance reports with several board members. Someone casually mentioned Little Cedar Chapel. "I heard they're still hanging on." Another laughed. "Barely." One board member suggested approaching Daniel again about merging congregations. It would save them. Ethan didn't answer immediately. He remembered meeting Daniel several times over the years. Always kind, always humble, always impossible to pity. Still, from a practical standpoint, keeping such a tiny church alive no longer made sense. He finally nodded. "I'll stop by next week." Back at Little Cedar Chapel, Daniel remained unaware of those plans. Instead, he found himself thinking about something entirely different. The mysterious pickup truck. It had not appeared since the night the wooden box had been left beside the mailbox. Nearly a month had passed. No note, no explanation, no return. Then, on another quiet Sunday morning, just as Daniel unlocked the front doors before sunrise, he noticed fresh tire tracks cutting through the damp gravel near the mailbox. Someone had been there again. There was no truck in sight, no wooden box this time, only a single envelope resting carefully against the post. Across the front, written in the same careful handwriting that appeared on the old envelopes inside the box, were just 4 words. "For Pastor Brooks alone." Daniel picked it up slowly. It felt strangely familiar, and before he even broke the seal, he realized his own name had been written by someone who seemed to know far more about him than he had ever known about them. Daniel carried the envelope into his office, but didn't open it right away. He set it on the corner of his worn oak desk beside an old Bible, a chipped coffee mug, and the attendance ledger that had become thinner with every passing year. Outside his office window, Martha could be heard practicing the opening hymn, her fingers moving carefully across the piano keys, while the old instrument answered with notes that seemed to know every sorrow the room had ever held. For several minutes he simply stared at the handwriting. It was neat, steady, intentional, not the hurried script of someone dropping off a donation or asking for prayer. Whoever had written it had taken their time. Finally, he slid one finger beneath the flap. Inside was a single sheet of cream-colored paper. Pastor Brooks, you don't know me. At least, I don't think you do. But I've known you for a very long time. Please don't try to find me yet. The time isn't right. There are things you need to discover before we meet. For now, I only ask one thing. Keep opening the church doors. Someone is coming who believes there is no place left for them. If you lock those doors, they'll never walk through them. Trust that God is already working where you cannot see him. We'll meet soon. Daniel read the letter 3 times. There was no signature, only a tiny drawing in the bottom corner. A simple wooden cross, exactly like the one held by the little boy in the old photograph from the mysterious box. He folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his Bible. The words should have unsettled him. Instead, they gave him an unexpected sense of peace. He couldn't explain why. Emily's second newspaper article appeared 2 days later. The headline read, "The Church That Quietly Changed the World." Rather than focusing on attendance, she told the forgotten history of Little Cedar Chapel. She wrote about missionaries who had carried hope across oceans, teachers who had opened schools, doctors who had built clinics, farmers who had quietly financed orphanages without anyone knowing. Each story began in the same little sanctuary with peeling paint and a leaking roof. Readers across Kansas responded. Former residents mailed old photographs. One family found baptism certificates tucked inside a cedar chest. Another sent letters written by grandparents who had once attended revival meetings there nearly 60 years earlier. Emily's email inbox filled faster than she had ever seen. One message stood out. "My grandfather always said Little Cedar Chapel saved our family. If you ever tell its story, don't forget the people nobody noticed." It wasn't signed. Only the initials, J.M. She stared at the message for several minutes before printing it. Something bigger was unfolding. She could feel it. Meanwhile, Jacob had begun spending nearly every Saturday at the church. His court-ordered community service had officially ended. No one expected him to return. Yet every weekend, he showed up carrying a toolbox he had borrowed from a neighbor. One Saturday he replaced loose floorboards. The next he repaired broken fencing around the cemetery. Another week he spent 6 straight hours sanding old wooden pews. Daniel never asked why. Eventually Jacob answered without being asked. "You know what I figured out?" "What?" "This is the only place where nobody expects me to stay the same." Daniel looked up from repairing a cabinet hinge. "What do you mean?" Jacob shrugged. "At school, they think you're trouble." "Yeah, in town. They remember my mistakes." Jacob nodded. "But here," he ran one hand across the smooth wood of the pew. "You just keep handing me another job." Daniel smiled. "That's because people usually become what someone believes they're capable of." Jacob laughed softly. "I hope you're right. So do I." The following Sunday, 11 people attended. One more than the week before. No one mentioned it. The next Sunday, there were 12. Again, no one celebrated. By the third week, there were 15. Martha quietly carried extra coffee cups downstairs after service. Daniel noticed, but said nothing. He didn't want numbers becoming the story. The story was people. One elderly couple had driven nearly 90 miles after reading Emily's article. "My parents were married here," the husband explained. "We wanted to see it one more time." Another visitor had been baptized there as a child before moving to Colorado decades earlier. A young family passing through Kansas stopped after searching online for historic country churches. Each person came with a different reason. Each left saying nearly the same thing. It felt peaceful. Emily heard that phrase over and over. Peaceful. Not exciting. Not impressive. Peaceful. She began wondering whether peace had become something people were desperately searching for, without realizing it. Pastor Ethan Mercer finally visited Little Cedar Chapel. He arrived on a Thursday afternoon wearing jeans instead of a suit, hoping the conversation would feel less formal. Daniel welcomed him with coffee. They sat on the front porch overlooking fields beginning to turn golden beneath the late summer sun. "I've been meaning to stop by." "I know. I suppose you've heard people talking. Daniel smiled. People usually do. Ethan hesitated. I'll be honest. I appreciate honesty. I still think merging with us would solve a lot of problems. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. It probably would. Ethan blanked. You agree? In many ways, so. Daniel looked across the empty parking lot. I've prayed about it. And I never felt released to leave. Ethan leaned back. You know, from a leadership perspective. Daniel laughed gently. I suspected there was going to be a leadership perspective. Both men smiled. I just hate seeing you carry all this. Daniel looked toward the sanctuary. I don't feel like I'm carrying it. No. What if attendance never grows? Daniel answered almost immediately. Then I'll keep opening the doors. What if only 10 people come? I'll preach to 10. What if only 5 come? I'll preach to 5. And 1? Daniel smiled. I've preached to 1 before. Ethan couldn't help laughing. I believe you. There was a long silence. Finally, Ethan admitted something he had never said aloud. Sometimes I stand in front of 1,500 people. Daniel listened, and I still wonder whether I'm succeeding. Daniel looked at him with quiet kindness. I think every pastor wonders that. Ethan lowered his eyes. For the first time in years, he realized the older man wasn't competing with him. He never had been. That weekend, Jacob asked Emily a surprising favor. You still have that camera? I do. Can you help me make a video? She smiled. What kind of video? I don't know. I've never done this before. What do you want to say? Jacob looked toward the sanctuary where Daniel was sweeping the front steps before Sunday service. I don't want to talk. You don't? I just want people to see him. Emily thought for a moment. That's actually a better idea. The next morning they arrived before sunrise, without Daniel noticing. Emily filmed quietly from a distance. She captured him unlocking the doors, straightening hymnals, replacing burned-out candles, picking up a tiny toy car someone had accidentally left months earlier, and placing it carefully in the lost-and-found basket, instead of throwing it away. She filmed him kneeling alone in the first pew before anyone arrived. Not dramatically, simply praying. Jacob watched through the camera screen. He does this every week? Emily nodded. Every single week. After service, she edited the footage into a simple 3-minute video. No music, except the sound already recorded inside the church. No dramatic narration. Only one sentence appeared at the very end. He prepares every seat like someone is coming. Jacob uploaded it to social media before either of them had time to overthink it. Neither expected much. By bedtime, the video had been viewed a little over 800 times. Mostly local people. Jacob shrugged. That's more than I thought. Emily smiled. Me too. They went to sleep. Monday morning, Daniel arrived at Carter Farm Supply before sunrise. The store owner walked toward him holding a phone. You've seen this? Seen what? He handed Daniel the screen. The number beneath Jacob's video had climbed overnight. 32,000 views. Thousands of comments. People from all over the country shared stories about the small churches where they had grown up. Others remembered elderly pastors who had quietly served for decades without recognition. Some admitted they hadn't attended church in years. One comment appeared again and again. I miss places like this. Daniel handed the phone back. Well, the owner grinned. You're internet famous. Daniel laughed. I sincerely hope not. By lunchtime, the number passed 200,000. National Christian organizations began sharing the video. Local television stations contacted Emily asking permission to use clips. Jacob's inbox exploded with messages. One in particular made him stop breathing for a second. I watched your video while sitting in a hospital waiting room. I haven't prayed in 20 years. Today I did. Thank you. Jacob read it 3 more times. His eyes filled with tears. For the first time in his young life, he realized that something God had done through him had reached someone he would probably never meet. The following Sunday, the parking lot filled faster than anyone had ever seen. Cars lined the road. Families carried folding chairs. Visitors stood along the back wall because every pew had been occupied. Martha looked around with trembling hands before beginning the first hymn. She quietly wiped away tears. Daniel stood behind the pulpit in complete silence. He hadn't prepared for this, not emotionally. He recognized almost no one, yet every face carried the same expression. Hope. He opened his Bible. I've spent many years wondering if these seats would ever be full again. A soft laugh moved through the congregation. "I'm grateful you're here." He paused. "But I need you to know something." The room grew perfectly still. "If you came because of a viral video," he smiled warmly, "welcome. Welcome more laughter. But if you come back," his voice became softer, "I hope it isn't because of this little church." He looked around the sanctuary. "I hope it's because, somewhere along the way, you discovered that God had been waiting for you long before you found this place." Many people quietly nodded. Others wiped tears. Emily watched from the back with her notebook closed for once. No article could capture what she was witnessing. Some moments were simply meant to be lived. After the service ended, visitors lingered outside for hours, sharing stories with complete strangers as if old friends had somehow found one another. Daniel finally slipped away toward the mailbox, hoping for a few quiet minutes. The familiar gravel beside the post was empty. No truck, no envelope. He smiled anyway. Then he noticed something tucked beneath the mailbox flag. It wasn't another letter. It was a faded photograph. On the back, written in the same careful handwriting, were 7 words that sent a chill through his entire body. "You baptized me here 31 years ago." Daniel stood alone beside the mailbox as the last of the afternoon sunlight stretched across the wheat fields, the faded photograph trembling slightly between his fingers. On the front was the same little boy from the old church picture. This time, he wasn't standing beside Pastor Harold Simmons. He was standing in the baptismal pool. A much younger Daniel Brooks stood beside him, one hand gently resting on the boy's shoulder. Daniel stared at his own younger face. His hair had still been dark then. His smile looked almost shy. The date written in the corner stopped him cold. May 14, 1995. 31 years earlier. He searched every corner of his memory. Faces from weddings, hospital rooms, funerals, vacation Bible schools, youth camps. Thousands of conversations, thousands of hands shaken, thousands of prayers whispered. But the little boy's face remained just out of reach, like a dream that disappeared the moment someone tried to remember it. The handwriting on the back continued beneath the first sentence. "You probably don't remember me. You baptized hundreds. But after that day, you never stopped changing my life." Daniel slowly folded the photograph and slipped it into his jacket pocket. He looked across the empty road. No truck, no footprints, only the wind moving through the tall grass. Whoever the man was, he always seemed to arrive just before anyone noticed and leave just before anyone could speak to him. Over the next several weeks, life at Little Cedar Chapel changed in ways no one could have imagined. The sanctuary that had once echoed with silence now filled with conversations before service. Children laughed in the fellowship hall again. Teenagers leaned against the porch railing talking long after worship ended. The old coffee pot struggled to keep up. Martha joked that after 40 years of making coffee for 10 people, she suddenly needed to learn how to make it for 50. Yet Daniel quietly insisted on one thing. Nothing about the church would become a performance. No stage lights, no giant screens, no celebrity guests, no campaign promising revival. "We're not trying to become something new," he told the congregation one Sunday. "We're simply trying to remain faithful while God brings the people he chooses." Most nodded. A few seemed disappointed. Some visitors had arrived expecting the little country church to transform into the next big attraction. Instead, they found ordinary people singing old hymns, sharing meals, praying with neighbors, and listening carefully when someone spoke. Oddly enough, that simplicity kept drawing people back. Del Paul. Emily noticed something even more surprising. The visitors weren't all Christians. Some admitted they hadn't entered a church in decades. Others confessed they had been hurt by churches years earlier and had sworn never to return. One woman drove 3 hours simply because Jacob's video reminded her of the church where her grandmother had taken her every Sunday as a little girl. "I didn't come looking for religion," she told Emily after the service. "I came looking for the feeling I used to have." "And did you find it?" The woman smiled through tears. "I think I found something even quieter." Emily wrote the sentence in her notebook. She never published it. Some stories deserve to remain personal. Jacob's own life continued changing one ordinary day at a time. His grades slowly improved. He found part-time work repairing fences for local farmers. He apologized to people he had stolen from. Some forgave him immediately. Others didn't. Daniel reminded him that repentance didn't guarantee instant trust. It means becoming the kind of person who keeps showing up even after forgiveness is offered. Jacob nodded. I guess trust grows slower, then guilt disappears. Daniel smiled. Usually, one Saturday afternoon, while replacing broken boards on the church porch, Jacob suddenly asked, "Do you ever wonder why God didn't just fix everything all at once?" Daniel looked up from his hammer. "What do you mean?" "I mean, if he wanted people to come back, why wait all these years?" Daniel rested the hammer against the porch rail. "I've asked questions like that myself, and I've never received a complete answer." Jacob laughed. "That sounds frustrating." "It can be. So how do you live with that?" Daniel looked across the fields where combines rolled slowly through golden wheat. "Farmers don't dig up seeds every week to see if they're growing." Jacob followed his gaze. "They trust what's happening underground." Daniel nodded. "So do I." One Thursday afternoon, Ethan Mercer returned. This time, he wasn't alone. 2 members of Grace Summit's leadership board came with him. Daniel welcomed them into the fellowship hall. After coffee and conversation, Ethan finally spoke. "I owe you an apology." Daniel looked surprised. "For what?" "I spent years believing success looked a certain way." Daniel remained quiet. "I measured faithfulness by attendance charts, budgets, expansion plans." He smiled awkwardly. "I even thought I was coming here to rescue you." Daniel chuckled softly. "You weren't the first. And now?" Ethan looked around the crowded fellowship hall, where volunteers prepared meals for several local families facing financial hardship. "I think I misunderstood what God was already doing." Daniel shook his head gently. "We've both been learning." One of Ethan's board members looked puzzled. "You aren't upset with us?" Daniel smiled. "Why would I be? We encouraged your church to close. You wanted what you believed was best." The man lowered his eyes. "I was wrong." Daniel reached across the table. "No." Everyone looked at him. "You were incomplete." The room grew quiet. "There are seasons for large churches." He smiled toward Ethan. "And they're a blessing." Then he looked around Little Cedar Chapel. "There are seasons for little churches, too. Neither is more important. They're simply different tools in the same carpenter's hand." Ethan laughed. "I think I needed to hear that more than anyone." The 2 pastors embraced before leaving. Emily happened to photograph the moment through the fellowship hall window. The image spread almost as widely as Jacob's video. Its caption simply read, "Kingdom before competition." Thousands shared it. Meanwhile, the mystery deepened. 3 more anonymous letters arrived over the next month. Each contained another small piece of a story. The first included a newspaper clipping from 1998 describing a family rescued after losing everything in a house fire. One sentence had been circled. A local pastor organized immediate help. The second held a faded receipt from a grocery store. On the back, someone had written, "You paid for our food when my mother couldn't." The third contained only a child's crayon drawing of Little Cedar Chapel. Across the bottom, crooked handwriting read, "Thank you for letting me stay." No names, no signature, only the same tiny wooden cross. Daniel finally showed everything to Emily. She spread the letters across the fellowship hall table. "They're connected. I know. They aren't random memories. No, they're building towards something." Daniel nodded slowly. "I think someone is telling a story." Emily studied the handwriting. "They're also telling it in order." That realization sent a chill through both of them. Whoever the mysterious visitor was, he wasn't simply thanking Daniel. He was leading him somewhere. One rainy evening, Emily drove to the county records office. Something had been bothering her for days. The old photograph, the date, the little boy. She requested baptism records for May 1995. The elderly clerk disappeared into storage before returning with a thick ledger covered in dust. Emily carefully turned page after page. Finally, she found the entry. May 14, 1995. 7 baptisms. The first 6 names meant nothing to her. The 7th stopped her heart. There was no last name, only a first name, Nathan. Beside it, Pastor Daniel Brooks had written a short note, brought by temporary guardian. Parents unknown. Emily read the line again. Parents unknown. She quickly searched other church records. Nothing. No membership file. No address. No transfer letter. No funeral. It was as if the little boy had appeared for one season, then vanished completely. She copied every page she could find before driving straight to Daniel's house. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, neither of them spoke for nearly a minute. Finally, Daniel whispered, "I remember him." Emily leaned forward. "You do?" "Not clearly." He closed his eyes. He never smiled. "What happened to him?" "I don't know." "You lost contact?" Daniel nodded sadly. There were several foster children back then. His voice grew quieter. They moved so often. Emily looked at the photograph again. So Nathan could be. Daniel finished the thought. The man leaving the letters. Before either of them could say another word, headlights swept across Daniel's living room window. Both turned. An old pickup truck rolled slowly to the curb. For the first time in months, it didn't drive away. The driver's door opened. A man stepped out. He looked to be in his late 30s. Broad shoulders, weathered face, work boots covered in dust. He stood beside the truck for several seconds, staring at the house as though gathering courage that had taken decades to find. Daniel slowly opened the front door. The two men looked at one another across the yard. Neither spoke. Then the stranger reached into his jacket. Instead of another letter, he pulled out a small wooden cross, the same one the little boy had been holding in the photograph 31 years earlier. Daniel's breath caught. The man smiled through eyes already filling with tears. In a voice barely louder than a whisper, he finally said the words Daniel had unknowingly been waiting more than 3 decades to hear. "You told me, if I ever got lost again." He held up the little cross. "This would help me find my way home." Daniel stood frozen in the doorway, unable to speak. The evening breeze drifted across the yard, carrying the scent of fresh-cut hay and the distant hum of combines finishing the last fields before sunset. For a long moment, neither man moved. Nathan held the little wooden cross with both hands, as though it were the most valuable thing he had ever owned. Daniel looked from the cross to the man's face. The lines of childhood were still there. The cautious eyes, the habit of standing half a step back, as if expecting someone to tell him he wasn't welcome. Only now those eyes belonged to a man who had lived an entire lifetime since they had last met. Daniel slowly walked down the porch steps. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Nathan blinked. "For what?" "I'm sorry I didn't recognize you." Nathan's eyes filled with tears, but he smiled. "You recognized me once." Daniel looked confused, when no one else did. The words settled between them like the first drops of rain before a storm. Without another thought, Daniel embraced him. Neither man cared that Emily was standing quietly near the doorway, witnessing the reunion. Neither noticed the tears running down Martha's face as she stepped out of the fellowship hall after finishing preparations for the Wednesday meal. For nearly 30 years, Nathan had imagined this moment. He had rehearsed speeches, questions, explanations. Instead, all that remained was silence. The kind of silence only people who have carried the same invisible burden can understand. Eventually, Daniel stepped back. "You'd better come inside." Nathan smiled. "I was hoping you'd say that." Coffee sat untouched for nearly an hour. Nathan looked around the fellowship hall as if he were visiting a place from a dream. The floor's different. Daniel laughed. "We replaced it in 2008. The old piano. Martha refused to let anyone throw it away." Nathan smiled toward her. "You still play. As long as these fingers cooperate." She wiggled her arthritic hands. "They complain every Sunday." Nathan laughed for the first time. "It sounds exactly the same. You remember?" "I remember everything." He looked around the room. "I just didn't think anyone here would remember me." Daniel leaned forward. "Tell me." Nathan nodded slowly. "My mother struggled with addiction." Daniel quietly listened. "I never knew my father. I entered foster care when I was 6. He paused. "I stopped counting homes after 12. The room remained completely still. One Sunday." Nathan looked toward the sanctuary doors. "My foster parents brought me here." Daniel's memory began returning in fragments. A frightened little boy who refused to leave the back pew. A child who jumped whenever someone raised their voice. One who always carried a small toy truck with a missing wheel. "I remember now," Daniel whispered. Nathan smiled. "You gave me hot chocolate." Daniel laughed softly. "I did, and you sat beside me instead of asking me questions." Another memory surfaced. "You wouldn't speak." Nathan nodded. Not for weeks. Daniel closed his eyes. Now he remembered. The little boy had watched every family leave church holding hands. Every Sunday, without fail, one afternoon, after everyone else had gone home, Nathan had quietly asked, "Does God know where kids go after people stop looking for them?" Daniel had never forgotten the question. He had simply forgotten the face. "I told you," Nathan smiled, "that God had never lost my address." Daniel nodded, tears welling in his eyes. "I remember. You carved this." Nathan lifted a little wooden cross. "You said whenever I felt alone." His voice broke. "I should hold it until I remembered whose I was." No one spoke. Some gifts become priceless only after decades have passed. Nathan took a slow breath. "I disappeared because another foster family moved me across the state. I wanted to come back. I didn't know how. When I turned 18, I started working construction. I got married. My wife loved Jesus." A smile spread across his face. "She taught me how to believe that grace wasn't something you borrowed." Daniel listened carefully. "We had a daughter." The smile faded. "She died from leukemia when she was 9. The room fell silent again. Nathan stared into his untouched coffee. "I almost walked away from God." "No, I did walk away. For years. I buried the cross in a toolbox. I couldn't even look at it." He swallowed hard. "Then last winter I found it while cleaning the garage." He laughed softly through tears. "Funny thing about old wood." "What?" "What? It remembers your hands." Daniel smiled gently. Nathan continued, "I drove here the next Sunday. I parked out by the fence. I saw the church. I saw you unlocking the doors. I couldn't get out. So I left. The next week I came back. And the next. And the next." Emily finally asked the question everyone had been wondering. "Why didn't you come inside?" Nathan looked toward the sanctuary. "Because I wasn't sure God still wanted me." Daniel answered before anyone else could. He never stopped. Nathan smiled. "I know that now." He reached into the old wooden box he had brought from his truck. "I've carried something for years." Inside were dozens of envelopes, everyone carefully labeled by date. "I started writing these after my daughter died." Daniel recognized them immediately. "The letters." Nathan nodded. "I wanted to thank you. But every time I tried, I wasn't ready. So I kept writing." Emily slowly opened one with Nathan's permission. Inside was a handwritten memory. "You visited me every Wednesday after school." Another. "You taught me to sand old pews." Another. "You told me churches aren't buildings." Another. "You never looked disappointed when only a few people showed up." Daniel shook his head. "I didn't know anyone noticed." Nathan laughed quietly. "Children notice everything." He reached into the bottom of the box. There was one more thing. He carefully unfolded a stack of legal documents. "I recently sold my construction company." Daniel looked puzzled. Nathan continued, "My wife and I never had another child, so we started a foundation in our daughter's name." Emily glanced at the papers. The foundation's mission was simple: restore small rural churches that still served forgotten communities. Nathan slid the documents across the table. "The first gift," Daniel's eyes widened, "is for Little Cedar Chapel." He looked down at the number. For several long seconds he couldn't breathe. It wasn't just enough to repair the roof, or replace the furnace, or repaint the building. It was enough to restore the church completely, to create a community food pantry, to renovate classrooms for children, to establish a counseling center for struggling families, to ensure the little church would never again wonder whether the lights could stay on another month. Daniel quietly pushed the papers back. "Nathan, no, I can't." Nathan smiled. "You already did. I only brought back what was planted." The restoration took nearly a year. Volunteers arrived from neighboring towns. Some had seen Jacob's video. Others had read Emily's articles. Grace Summit Church sent dozens of workers. Pastor Ethan himself spent 3 weekends replacing windows beside Jacob. No one argued about denominations. No one cared whose church it was. For a while, it simply felt like the kingdom of God looked exactly the way Jesus intended. Neighbors serving neighbors without asking who would receive the credit. The old sanctuary was carefully restored, not modernized. The worn wooden pews remained. The stained glass windows were repaired rather than replaced. The original bell still rang every Sunday morning. Only now its sound carried farther because there were more hearts willing to answer it. The fellowship hall became a place where lonely widowers found friends over coffee. Children filled Sunday school rooms again. Single mothers found practical help without embarrassment. Farmers facing difficult seasons found people willing to pray with them, and sometimes quietly pay a utility bill before anyone else knew. Little Cedar Chapel had not become famous. It had become useful. Daniel preferred it that way. One bright autumn morning, exactly 1 year after Nathan had finally stepped out of his truck, every pew was filled once again. Not because of a viral video, not because of newspaper headlines. Those moments had faded. People had stayed because they had discovered something rare, a place where no one asked how impressive you were before deciding whether you belonged. Daniel looked across the sanctuary. Martha played the opening hymn with hands that still ached. Jacob now helped lead the youth group, smiling as several teenagers joked with him before the service. Emily sat near the middle with a notebook resting closed in her lap. She had stopped trying to capture every meaningful moment. Some moments were richer simply because they were lived. Nathan sat quietly beside his wife. The little wooden cross rested in his jacket pocket. When Daniel stepped to the pulpit, he didn't begin with announcements. He simply looked around the room. 30 years earlier he had worried that empty pews meant failure. Now he understood something. He wished he had learned much sooner. God had never been counting chairs. He had been shaping hearts. Daniel smiled. I've spent a lifetime opening these doors. He paused. I used to pray that God would fill this room. He looked toward the back pew where Nathan had once hidden as a frightened little boy. Now I realize. His voice softened. He was filling people long before he filled pews. A quiet amen rose somewhere in the congregation. Not loud, just sincere. After the service, children raced across the church lawn while older couples lingered beneath the oak tree, telling stories that would probably grow a little better with every passing year. Daniel stood near the mailbox, the same mailbox where mysterious letters had once appeared. Nathan walked over and joined him. No more envelopes, Daniel said with a smile. Nathan laughed. I think we've finally run out. They stood together watching families load children into cars. You know, Nathan said, I used to think the miracle was that this church became full again. Daniel glanced at him. And now? Nathan looked across the parking lot. I think the miracle was that you kept unlocking the door when almost nobody came. Daniel smiled. So did someone else. As the last car disappeared down the country road, the evening sun settled behind the wheat fields, casting long golden shadows across Little Cedar Chapel. The old bell rang once. Then again, its sound drifted across Willow Creek just as it had for more than a century. Somewhere in the distance, a farmer paused his tractor for a moment. A waitress looked up from the diner window. A child asked his mother why the church bells were ringing. Life went on, quietly, faithfully, just as it always had. And perhaps that was the greatest lesson of all. The most extraordinary works of God often begin so quietly that the world mistakes them for ordinary. Until one day, people look back and realize that while they were waiting for something spectacular, God had been transforming lives one faithful act at a time. Because in the end, the story was never about a tiny church. It was never about empty pews. It was never even about a viral video. It was about a shepherd who never stopped opening the door, because he knew there were still lost sheep making their way home. And if this story leaves us with one truth worth carrying into tomorrow, it is this. Never measure God's faithfulness by what looks empty today. The seeds planted in love, watered with patience, and entrusted to Him often bloom long after we think the season has passed. Sometimes the greatest miracle isn't that God fills a room, it's that He never stops calling people home until every heart willing to answer has found its place.